London, 1817. The difference between a dream and a nightmare is often just a matter of waking up. I, Lady Catherine Ashford, never imagined that falling asleep during a ball would seal my fate, that a moment of exhaustion would bind me to a crown, that a stranger's kindness would transform into a royal decree. But what I really didn't know is that sometimes the most unconventional beginnings lead to the most extraordinary love stories. This is the story of a woman who defied every expectation of her time and found herself exactly where she was meant to be. But before we dive into this story that challenged the very foundations of royal protocol, tell me, from what corner of the world are you watching? Leave your comment, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because this journey promises to be unforgettable. Truth is always more fascinating than fiction. The sensation of movement was what woke me first. Not the gentle rocking of my own bed, but the rhythmic bounce of carriage wheels over cobblestone roads. My eyes opened slowly, reluctantly, as consciousness crept back with all the grace of an uninvited guest at a garden party. For a moment, I simply stared at the unfamiliar ceiling above me, cream-colored silk with gold embroidery that caught the morning light filtering through curtained windows. This was not my room. This was not even my carriage. I sat up with a start that sent my head spinning, my hand instinctively reaching for the window curtain to steady myself. That was when I noticed it, the weight on my left hand that hadn't been there before. A ring. Not just any ring, but an elaborate affair of sapphires and diamonds set in gold. The kind of jewelry that whispered of old money and older titles. The kind of ring that declared intentions far more permanent than a simple evening's acquaintance. My heart began to pound with a tempo that would have made even the most enthusiastic orchestra conductor proud. I stared at the ring as if looking at it long enough might make it disappear, might reveal this entire situation to be some sort of elaborate jest. It did not disappear. If anything, it seemed to catch the light more brilliantly, as if mocking my confusion. The carriage door bore a crest I didn't immediately recognize. 2 lions rampant beneath a crown, surrounding what appeared to be a mountain, or perhaps a fortress. European, certainly, but which country, I couldn't immediately place. My education in heraldry, I realized with some chagrin, had been far less thorough than my governess had claimed. I searched my memory for the events of the previous evening with the desperation of someone looking for a lost earring in a ballroom. The grand summer ball at the Auvergnian embassy. My friend Charlotte had been insistent that I attend, using that particular tone of voice that suggested refusal was not truly an option. She had promised music, champagne, and interesting company, in that order. What she had actually delivered was a parade of tedious gentlemen, each more convinced of their own fascinating nature than the last. There had been Lord Pemberton, who spent 20 minutes describing his hunting dogs. Then Mr. Fitzgerald, whose discourse on the proper cultivation of roses nearly put me to sleep standing up. After him came a blur of faces and names, each accompanied by conversation so monumentally dull that I found myself contemplating the architectural features of the ceiling with more interest than their words. By midnight, I had reached my limit. The ballroom had felt suffocating, the music too loud, the champagne too sweet. I had slipped away, seeking refuge in the quieter corners of the embassy. That was when I found the music room. The memory came back with sudden clarity. A small, intimate space with walls lined in books and a grand piano situated near the windows. And sitting at that piano, playing Chopin with a melancholy that seemed to reach directly into my chest and squeeze, was a man I had never seen before. He had dark hair that fell slightly over his forehead, as if he had run his fingers through it too many times. His profile was striking. Strong jaw, straight nose, the kind of face that would have made classical sculptors weep with joy, but it was his expression that had caught my attention. He looked as exhausted by the evening's festivities as I felt, playing music that spoke of loneliness and longing. When he noticed me standing in the doorway, he didn't startle or stop playing. Instead, he had simply gestured to the space beside him on the piano bench with a slight tilt of his head, as if inviting me to join him was the most natural thing in the world. I should have declined. Propriety demanded that I introduce myself, perhaps make polite conversation, and then return to the ballroom. But I was tired of propriety, tired of polite conversation, and decidedly uninterested in returning to the ballroom. So I sat, and we talked. Or rather, we exchanged observations about the tedium of formal events, the pressure of social expectations, and the particular torture of making small talk with people who had nothing interesting to say. His humor was dry, his insights sharp, and for the first time that evening, I felt like I could breathe properly. I couldn't recall his name. Had he even told me his name? The conversation had been so refreshingly informal that standard introductions might have been skipped entirely. He had asked me what I thought of the music, and I had answered honestly that I preferred Chopin's nocturnes to his polonaises. This had sparked a discussion about romantic composers that was infinitely more engaging than anything happening in the ballroom. And then he had played. A waltz, soft and gentle, the kind of music that wrapped around you like a warm blanket on a cold night. I remembered feeling my eyes grow heavy, remembered the comfortable solidity of his shoulder as my head drifted sideways. I remembered thinking, with the fuzzy logic of someone half asleep, that he smelled pleasantly of sandalwood and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something that felt safe. And then, nothing. Until waking up in this carriage. I pressed my palm against my forehead, trying to force my thoughts into some semblance of order. There had to be a reasonable explanation. Perhaps I had been ill, and arrangements had been made for my transport home, though that didn't explain the ring, or why we appeared to be traveling through countryside rather than London streets. A knock on the carriage wall made me jump. A small panel slid open, revealing what I assumed was the driver's compartment. A voice spoke in accented English, formal and respectful. He informed me that we would be stopping shortly for refreshment, and that His Highness had requested that I be made comfortable for the remainder of the journey. His Highness? The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had fallen asleep on the shoulder of a prince. The man at the piano had been royalty. My mind raced through the implications, each more horrifying than the last. The scandal, the talk, the absolute destruction of my reputation. But there was something more. The ring, the journey, the way the driver had spoken as if this were all perfectly ordinary. A horrible suspicion began to form in my mind, too outrageous to be true, yet somehow fitting all the pieces together. When the carriage stopped at a coaching inn, I was helped down by a footman who treated me with a deference that confirmed my worst fears. Inside, a private dining room had been prepared, and there, standing by the window with his back to me, was the man from the piano. In daylight, he was even more striking, tall, with the kind of bearing that spoke of military training and royal education. When he turned to face me, his expression was carefully controlled, but I could see concern in his dark eyes. He greeted me, calling me Princess Catherine. The title hit me like ice water. Princess. Not lady, not miss. Princess. I must have looked as stricken as I felt, because he immediately moved forward, gesturing to a chair and assuring me that he could explain everything. His voice was gentle, apologetic even, but there was an underlying tension that suggested he was as unsettled by this situation as I was. I sat because my legs suddenly felt unreliable. My voice, when I found it, was remarkably steady given the circumstances. I asked him to explain, preferably quickly and with complete honesty. He took a breath and began. After I had fallen asleep, he explained, a group of diplomats had burst into the music room. They had been drinking heavily and were in high spirits. Finding us there, a young woman asleep on his shoulder, they had immediately jumped to conclusions. Scandalous conclusions. To prevent the scandal from spreading, he had made a split-second decision. He announced that we were secretly engaged, that the reason for our seclusion was entirely honorable. The diplomats, drunk as they were, had been delighted by this romantic revelation. They promised to keep the secret, though he knew such promises were worthless. By morning, the rumor had spread throughout the embassy and beyond. His brother, the crown prince, had gotten wind of it and decided to take matters into his own hands. Seeing an opportunity to strengthen relations between Auvergne and England, he had arranged for an immediate marriage ceremony. The documents had been prepared, the authorities convinced of the urgency, and before Alexandre could fully comprehend what was happening, we were legally wed. He told me all this with increasing horror in his voice, as if hearing it aloud made him realize anew the absolute madness of it all. He assured me that he had every intention of seeking an annulment, that I would be compensated for any damage to my reputation, that I could return to England immediately if I wished. I stared at him. This stranger, this prince, my husband, The ring on my finger suddenly felt unbearably heavy. I twisted it unconsciously, the unfamiliar weight a constant reminder of how drastically my life had changed in the span of a single sleep. My mind catalogued the impossibility of the situation with the kind of detached precision I typically reserved for household accounts. I was married to a prince of a country I had never visited because I had fallen asleep during a ball. The sheer absurdity of it would have been laughable if it weren't so catastrophically life-altering. I thought of my mother, who would likely faint when she received the news. My father, who would demand explanations I couldn't possibly provide. Charlotte, who would blame herself for insisting I attend the ball in the first place. And my own future, which had been irrevocably altered by a moment of exhaustion and an act of chivalry gone horribly awry. Prince Alexandre watched me with apprehension, waiting for the outburst he clearly expected, the tears, perhaps, or the hysteria, but I had never been prone to either. Instead, I felt a curious numbness settling over me, a sense of unreality that made the entire situation feel like a very elaborate dream from which I would surely wake at any moment. But I didn't wake up. The ring remained on my finger, the prince remained before me, and the carriage outside remained ready to carry me further away from everything I had ever known. I asked him, with what I thought was admirable composure, where exactly we were going. The question seemed absurdly practical given the circumstances, but I clung to practicality because the alternative was allowing panic to take hold. To Auvergne, he replied, to the palace, where we would need to maintain the appearance of a legitimate marriage, at least until the political situation stabilized enough to pursue an annulment without causing an international incident. Maintain an appearance. The phrase struck me as particularly cruel. I was to play the role of devoted princess, while plans were made to dissolve a marriage I never agreed to in the first place. It was like being asked to audition for a play I had no interest in performing, with a script I hadn't been given and a co-star I had just met. I stood then, needing to move, needing to feel like I had some control over my own body even if I had none over my circumstances. I walked to the window, looking out at the English countryside rolling past. Soon, I knew, we would board a ship. Then we would be in Auvergne. And then I would be living a life I had never chosen, married to a man I didn't know, trapped in a gilded cage of protocol and political necessity. The prince said my name, Catherine, and I turned to look at him. He seemed genuinely distressed, as if my predicament troubled him as much as it troubled me. Perhaps it did. After all, he too was trapped in this situation, bound by circumstances neither of us had controlled. He promised me again that he would fix this, that he would find a way to undo what had been done, that I shouldn't have to suffer for his attempt to protect my reputation. The irony wasn't lost on me. He had destroyed my reputation while trying to save it, but looking at his earnest expression, I couldn't entirely blame him. He had been trying to do the right thing, to prevent a scandal that would have ruined me. That it had spiraled into something far worse was perhaps the fault of circumstance more than malice. I told him I understood. I didn't. Not really. But what else was there to say? The deed was done. I was married. A princess. Bound for a foreign land to live among strangers who would judge every word I spoke, every gesture I made. The meal passed in uncomfortable silence. Food was brought, though I couldn't have said what it was. I ate mechanically, my mind already racing ahead to what awaited me. A palace. A court. A queen mother who would undoubtedly view me as an upstart English girl who had trapped her son. Nobles who would wonder what kind of woman could possibly fall asleep on a prince without knowing who he was. When we returned to the carriage, I found myself studying Alexandre more carefully. He was handsome, certainly. Intelligent, from what little conversation we'd had. But he was a stranger. And strangers, no matter how well-intentioned, were still unknown quantities. As the carriage rolled onward, carrying me toward my unexpected destiny, I found myself thinking about fairy tales. How they always made these situations seem romantic, desirable even. The commoner swept away by the prince, the magical transformation from ordinary life to royal splendor. But fairy tales never mentioned the terror, the loss of control, the suffocating weight of expectations you never asked to bear. They never showed the princess by accident, staring at a ring she didn't choose, traveling to a country she'd never seen, to live a life she'd never wanted. As the English coast appeared on the horizon, I made myself a promise. Whatever happened next, however long this charade needed to continue, I would not lose myself in the process. I was Catherine Ashford, pragmatic, independent, and decidedly unprincess-like. If I had to play this role, I would do it on my own terms. Though as the ship came into view, and the reality of my situation settled more heavily on my shoulders, I couldn't help but wonder if such promises were just another form of fairy tale. Perhaps the girl who had fallen asleep at the piano was already gone, and the woman waking up was someone I didn't yet know. The Palace of Auvergne was not what I had expected, though, in fairness, I wasn't entirely sure what I had expected. Something from a storybook, perhaps. All white marble and fairy tale turrets. Instead, what greeted me as our carriage wound up the mountain road was a fortress that had been gradually softened over centuries into something approximating elegance. Stone walls that had once been purely defensive now bore decorative carvings. Windows that had been narrow slits for archers were now broad and welcoming. But underneath the veneer of civilization, the palace remained what it had always been, a stronghold, built to keep people either in or out. I wondered which category I fell into. The journey across the channel had been mercifully brief, though perhaps I should have wished for it to last longer. At least on the ship, I was in a liminal space, neither in England, nor truly in Auvergne, neither my old life, nor my new one. Once we docked, however, the reality of my situation crystallized with uncomfortable clarity. There had been people waiting. An entourage, Alexandra called it, though it looked more like a small army to me. Ladies-in-waiting I hadn't chosen, advisors I didn't know, and a gentleman with an impressively elaborate mustache who was introduced as the Royal Protocol Secretary. He had looked at me with the kind of assessment usually reserved for livestock at market, clearly cataloging every way in which I failed to meet the standards of a proper princess. The carriage ride through the Auvergnian countryside had been beautiful. I could admit that much. Rolling hills gave way to vineyards, which in turn yielded to forests of pine and oak. The people we passed stopped their work to watch our procession, some bowing, others simply staring. I wondered what they saw when they looked at our carriage. Did they know about the English girl who had accidentally married their prince? Or had some more palatable story been crafted for public consumption? Alexandra had traveled in a separate carriage, which I understood was protocol, but nonetheless felt like abandonment. I was left alone with my new lady-in-waiting, a woman named Madame Beaumont, who possessed the remarkable ability to speak for 30 minutes without actually saying anything of substance. She informed me about the weather patterns of Auvergne, the history of the palace gardens, and the proper way to curtsy to various ranks of nobility. What she did not tell me was anything useful, like whether the Queen Mother was inclined to be welcoming or hostile, or what exactly was expected of me beyond existing as decorative testament to Anglo-Auvergnian relations. Now, standing in what I had been informed was my apartment, a series of rooms so vast I could have fit my entire London townhouse inside them. I felt the full weight of my displacement settle upon me. The furniture was exquisite, all gilt and brocade. The walls were hung with tapestries depicting scenes from Auvergnian history that I didn't recognize. Even the ceiling was painted with clouds and cherubs, as if I needed a reminder that I was expected to live with my head literally in the heavens. A team of maids hovered nearby, clearly uncertain what to do with me. I had dismissed Madame Beaumont after she began a lecture on the proper arrangement of breakfast items, desperately needing a moment alone. But alone, I was discovering, was a relative term in palace life. The maids remained, ostensibly arranging my belongings, the few items that had been hastily packed and sent from London, but more accurately watching me with barely concealed curiosity. I walked to the windows, which at least offered a spectacular view of the palace grounds and the mountains beyond. The glass was old, slightly wavy, distorting the landscape in subtle ways. It seemed an apt metaphor for my new life, everything familiar but slightly wrong, viewed through a lens that changed the very nature of what I was seeing. A knock at the door interrupted my brooding. I turned to find Alexandre entering, looking as uncomfortable as I felt. He had changed into formal attire, the kind of elaborate uniform that declared his status far more clearly than the simple evening clothes he'd worn at the ball. Medals gleamed on his chest, gold braid decorated his shoulders, and a sword hung at his side. He looked every inch the prince, which I supposed with some bitterness was rather the point. He asked if my rooms were satisfactory, his tone carefully polite. We had apparently transitioned from the tentative camaraderie of the journey to the formal distance required by palace protocol. I assured him the rooms were lovely. which was true even if they felt like a very beautiful prison. He hesitated, clearly wanting to say something more but uncertain how to begin. Finally, he informed me that we would be dining with the royal family that evening. His mother, the Queen Mother, would be present, as would his brother, Crown Prince Leopold, and Leopold's wife, Princess Maria. It would be, he explained with obvious reluctance, my formal introduction to the family. The prospect filled me with a dread I tried very hard not to show. I asked what I should expect, trying to keep my voice level and merely curious rather than panicked. Alexandra's expression suggested the question was more complicated than it should be. He explained that his mother was a woman of strong opinions and traditional values. She had very specific ideas about proper royal behavior and the kind of woman suitable for her sons. An arranged marriage to a well-connected duchess had been her preference. An accidental marriage to an unknown English girl would not, he suggested with admirable understatement, be received with enthusiasm. I felt my spine stiffen at this. I might not have chosen this situation, but I would be damned if I would cower before anyone's disapproval. I told him I understood, and that I would do my best not to embarrass him. Something flickered across his face. Regret, perhaps, or frustration. He assured me that wasn't what concerned him, that I shouldn't have to endure judgment for circumstances beyond my control, but we both knew that shoulds and woulds had little bearing on what actually would happen. After he left, I stood in the center of my gilded apartment and tried very hard not to cry. Crying would serve no purpose. It would not return me to London, would not unmake my accidental marriage, would not transform me into the kind of princess this palace expected. So instead, I walked to the wardrobe where my hastily packed belongings had been arranged and began the process of preparing myself for battle. Because that, I was beginning to understand, was what dinner with the royal family would be. A battle fought with forks and wine glasses, where every word was a potential weapon and every gesture subject to interpretation. The maids helped me dress, though their assistance felt more like an assessment of my inadequacies. The gown that had been selected, not by me, I noted, was beautiful, but foreign. The style was different from English fashions, cut to emphasize different aspects of the figure. The maids laced me into it with the efficiency of soldiers arming a knight for tournament, their faces carefully neutral. One of them, younger than the others, ventured a comment as she arranged my hair. She said that I looked very pretty, her accent thick, but her tone genuinely kind. I thanked her, grateful for even this small gesture of warmth in a place that felt increasingly cold despite its physical grandeur. By the time I was deemed presentable, the sun had begun to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. A footman arrived to escort me to the dining room, and I followed him through a labyrinth of corridors that I was certain I would never be able to navigate independently. The palace was a maze, designed perhaps to keep foreign princesses from escaping. The dining room, when we finally reached it, was exactly as intimidating as I had feared. Long, formal, decorated with portraits of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to judge me from their frames. A table that could seat 30, but tonight would host only 5. And at its head, already seated, was a woman who could only be the Queen Mother. She was beautiful in the way that ancient statues are beautiful, cold, perfect, and utterly without warmth. Her silver hair was arranged in an elaborate style that must have taken hours. Her gown was black, elegant, and served to make her pale skin seem almost luminescent, but it was her eyes that caught my attention. Dark, intelligent, and currently fixed on me with an expression that suggested I was a problem she intended to solve. Alexandra was already present, standing behind a chair that I realized must be mine. His brother Leopold sat across from where I would be, a man who looked remarkably like Alexandra, but with softer features and a more openly curious expression. Beside him was Princess Maria, a delicate woman with kind eyes, who offered me a small, encouraging smile. The Queen Mother did not rise when I entered. She simply regarded me with that penetrating gaze, and I understood that this was intentional. She was establishing hierarchy, making clear that I was supplicant here, not equal. Alexandra performed the formal introductions, his voice carefully neutral. The Queen Mother acknowledged me with the barest inclination of her head, then suggested we should sit. Not invited, suggested, as if my sitting were a favor she was granting rather than a basic courtesy. The meal began with the kind of silence that felt loaded with unspoken words. Servants brought courses with practiced efficiency. Wine was poured, and through it all, I felt the weight of the Queen Mother's attention, like a physical presence. Finally, she spoke. Her English was flawless, her accent barely detectable, which somehow made her words cut more sharply. She remarked that my arrival had been quite unexpected, her tone suggesting this was not merely a statement of fact, but an accusation. I swallowed my wine carefully before responding, buying myself a moment to choose my words. I agreed that the circumstances of my arrival were unusual, but assured her that I hoped to fulfill my duties appropriately. Duties, she repeated, as if tasting the word and finding it wanting. She wondered aloud what duties I imagined I was capable of fulfilling, given my lack of preparation for royal life. The insult was clear, delivered with the precision of a surgeon's knife. I felt my cheeks warm but forced my expression to remain pleasant. I acknowledged that I had much to learn, but expressed confidence that with proper guidance, I would adapt. Leopold attempted to change the subject, commenting on the weather and some upcoming diplomatic function, but his mother silenced him with a look, her attention remaining fixed on me. She asked about my family, my education, my accomplishments. Each question was designed to expose my inadequacy. My father was a baron, respectable but hardly royal. My education had been thorough but conventional. No special tutors in statecraft or diplomatic history. My accomplishments were those of any well-bred English lady. I played the pianoforte adequately, spoke French reasonably well, could manage a household budget, all of which, her expression suggested, was hopelessly insufficient for a princess of Auvergne. Alexandra interjected at several points, trying to soften his mother's interrogation, but she overrode him with the ease of someone accustomed to absolute authority. Maria remained quiet, though I caught her shooting sympathetic glances in my direction. The Queen Mother eventually turned her attention to the manner of our marriage itself. She remarked that it was extraordinary how quickly the ceremony had been arranged, her tone making clear she found it not extraordinary but suspicious. I felt my temper beginning to fray. I had endured the journey, the displacement, the fear and uncertainty. I had dressed in unfamiliar clothes and attempted to navigate unfamiliar customs. I had been polite and deferential, despite every instinct screaming at me to defend myself. But there were limits to what I would tolerate, even from a queen. I set down my wineglass with perhaps more force than strictly necessary, and met her gaze directly. I told her that I understood this situation was not what she would have chosen for her son. It was not what I would have chosen for myself, either. But the marriage was legal and binding, and while I could not change the circumstances of its creation, I could certainly control how I conducted myself going forward. I had no intention of bringing shame to Alexandre or to Auvergne, but neither would I apologize for existing. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the servants seemed to freeze in place. Alexandre looked at me with something that might have been admiration or horror, possibly both. Leopold's eyebrows had risen so high they nearly disappeared into his hairline. Maria was smiling openly now, though she tried to hide it behind her napkin. The Queen Mother's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or possibly respect, though I might have been flattering myself. She informed me that she appreciated candor, even if she didn't always appreciate the sentiment behind it. Then she turned her attention to her meal, effectively dismissing me from her consideration. The rest of dinner passed with slightly less tension, though the atmosphere could hardly be called comfortable. Leopold made several attempts at pleasant conversation, asking about my impressions of Auvergne and sharing amusing anecdotes about court life. Maria added her own observations, her gentle kindness a balm after the Queen Mother's hostility. But throughout it all, I remained acutely aware of the Queen Mother's presence. She might have stopped interrogating me, but I had no illusion that I had won any sort of victory. If anything, I had likely made my situation more difficult by showing defiance, but I found I didn't entirely regret it. There were many things about my current predicament that I couldn't control, but I could at least control my own responses. When the meal finally ended, I stood with what I hoped was graceful dignity. The Queen Mother excused herself first, departing without another word to me. Leopold and Maria were kinder, expressing hope that we might become better acquainted. Maria even took my hand briefly, squeezing it in silent support. Alexandra walked with me back toward my apartments, though protocol demanded a chaperone follow at a discreet distance. For several minutes, we walked in silence through those endless corridors. Finally, he spoke. He told me that was remarkably brave, though perhaps not entirely wise. I asked if I had made things worse for myself. suddenly exhausted by the effort of maintaining composure. He considered this. Possibly, he admitted. His mother did not appreciate being challenged, but he also suspected she would have found fault regardless of how I conducted myself. At least this way, I had maintained my dignity. Dignity felt like cold comfort when facing a future of such hostility, but I appreciated his attempt at reassurance. We reached my apartments too soon. Or perhaps not soon enough. I was no longer certain which I preferred. Alexandre bid me good night with formal courtesy, but as he turned to leave, I found myself asking him a question that had been building throughout dinner. I asked him what would happen if we couldn't secure an annulment. If, for whatever political or legal reason, we remained married. He stopped, his back to me for a long moment. When he turned, his expression was troubled. He admitted he didn't know. The situation was unprecedented, but he assured me he would do everything in his power to give me back the life that had been taken from me. It was meant to be comforting, I knew, but as I closed the door to my beautiful, lonely apartments, I couldn't help but wonder if the life I'd had before was even one worth returning to. It had been safe, certainly, predictable, but had it been fulfilling? Had I been happy or merely content? These were dangerous thoughts, I knew, the kind that led to acceptance of unacceptable situations. But as I stood at my window, looking out at the unfamiliar stars above an unfamiliar land, I found myself thinking, not about the life I'd lost, but about the man at the piano who had played Chopin with such melancholy, the stranger who had tried to protect me from scandal and inadvertently trapped us both in something far more complicated. And I wondered, not for the last time, whether this gilded cage might somehow transform into something else entirely. The days following that first disastrous dinner developed a rhythm that was both monotonous and exhausting. I woke each morning in my vast bed, surrounded by more pillows than any reasonable person could require, and faced the prospect of another day spent learning to be someone I wasn't. Madame Beaumont arrived promptly at 8, bearing schedules and instructions with the enthusiasm of a general planning a military campaign. There were lessons in Auvergnat history, tutorials on proper forms of address for various nobles, instruction in the intricate dance steps favored at court. I was measured for new wardrobes, fitted with jewels I hadn't asked for, and coached on the precise angle at which a princess should hold her head. It was, in short, utterly suffocating. The Queen Mother remained distantly hostile, acknowledging my existence only when protocol demanded it. At formal dinners, she would occasionally direct questions at me that were clearly designed to expose my ignorance of Auvergnat customs or history. I learned to deflect rather than defend, to admit what I didn't know while expressing genuine interest in learning. It wasn't capitulation, I told myself. It was strategy. The court itself was a labyrinth more complex than the palace corridors. There were factions and alliances I didn't understand, ancient grudges and modern rivalries that everyone seemed to know about except me. Ladies whispered behind fans when I passed. Gentlemen bowed with exaggerated courtesy that felt more like mockery than respect. And through it all, there was Isabelle. Duchess Isabelle de Valmont was everything I was not. Beautiful in that effortless way that suggested she'd never had an awkward moment in her life. Elegant, with the kind of grace that came from generations of breeding and training. Accomplished in all the ways that mattered to court society, she spoke 5 languages fluently, played the harp like an angel, and could discuss philosophy and politics with equal ease. She was also, I learned within my first week at court, the woman everyone had expected Alexandre to marry. She made her feelings about my presence abundantly clear, though with such subtlety that outright objection was impossible. At social gatherings, she would position herself near Alexandre, engaging him in conversations about shared memories and mutual acquaintances. Conversations I couldn't possibly join. She would compliment my gowns with a tone that somehow suggested they were charmingly provincial. She would inquire after my adjustment to palace life with an expression of such sympathetic concern that everyone listening understood she thought I was hopelessly out of my depth. The worst part was that she wasn't wrong. I was out of my depth. Every day brought new evidence of my inadequacy. I used the wrong fork at dinner. I curtsied at the wrong depth to a visiting count. I accidentally sat in a chair reserved for the Archbishop during a reception, causing a minor scandal that had the Queen Mother's lips thinning to near invisibility. 2 weeks into my life as an accidental princess, I was ready to board the first ship back to England and face whatever scandal awaited me there. At least in London, I understood the rules. At least there, people insulted you to your face rather than behind elaborate fans. It was on a particularly difficult afternoon, following a morning where I'd mistakenly referred to the Auvergnian War of Succession as a rebellion, earning me a lecture from Madame Beaumont and pitying looks from assembled courtiers, that I retreated to the palace gardens. They were extensive, carefully manicured, and most importantly, offered the possibility of solitude. The weather was fine, spring having fully arrived with its promise of renewal that I found almost painfully ironic. I walked without direction, simply needing to move, to feel the sun on my face and breathe air that didn't smell of furniture polish and old money. Eventually, I found myself in a more remote section of the gardens, where the paths were less formal, and wildflowers grew between carefully tended roses. There was a bench beneath an old oak tree, and I sat heavily, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. That was where Alexander found me. I didn't hear him approach, lost as I was in my own misery, and startled when he spoke my name. He apologized for disturbing me, noting that he'd been told I'd come to the gardens and wanted to ensure I was well. I assured him I was fine, which we both knew was a lie. He asked if he could sit, and I gestured to the bench in response. We sat in silence for several moments, the only sounds the distant fountain and birds in the trees above us. Finally, he spoke. He'd heard about the morning's incident, he said, his tone carefully neutral. He wanted me to know that the War of Succession was a contentious topic in Auvergnian history, with scholars still debating whether it constituted a rebellion or a legitimate challenge to authority. My characterization, while perhaps not the one favored by court historians, was not without merit. I turned to look at him, surprised. He was looking out at the gardens, rather than at me, his profile thoughtful. It occurred to me that this was the first real conversation we'd had since that initial journey to Auvergne. We'd been in each other's presence countless times, at dinners, receptions, formal functions, but always surrounded by others, always performing our roles. I thanked him for the clarification, then admitted that I was beginning to think I wasn't suited for this life, that perhaps we should move forward with annulment proceedings regardless of the political complications. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked if I would walk with him, indicating a path that led deeper into the gardens. I agreed, grateful for the movement, and curious about his sudden pensiveness. As we walked, he began to speak more freely than he had since that first day. He told me that he understood my frustration, that he too often felt trapped by the demands of his position. His life had been carefully orchestrated since birth, which schools he attended, which skills he developed, which social circles he moved in. He'd had more freedom than his brother Leopold, being third in line rather than the heir, but even that freedom was relative. Every choice was made with an awareness of how it would reflect on the crown. I asked why he was telling me this, uncertain where this unusual candor was leading. He stopped walking, turning to face me with an expression that was difficult to read. He said he wanted me to understand that he knew what it felt like to be trapped in a life one hadn't chosen, that he regretted the circumstances that had brought me here. But he also wanted me to know that I wasn't alone in feeling displaced in my own existence. It was perhaps the most honest thing anyone had said to me since my arrival in Auvergne. I found myself responding with equal honesty. I told him that what frustrated me most wasn't the formality or even the hostility, but the uselessness. In England, I had managed my father's household after my mother's death. I had understood my purpose, had been genuinely useful. Here I was purely decorative, a pretty problem to be dressed appropriately and displayed at proper intervals. Something shifted in his expression. He asked what I had enjoyed most about managing the household, seeming genuinely curious. I considered this. The budgets, I told him. The practical problem-solving, finding efficiencies, negotiating with suppliers, ensuring resources were used wisely. It wasn't glamorous, but it had been satisfying in a way that learning to curtsy at precisely the right angle would never be. He smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in weeks. He told me that Auvergne's royal household was notoriously inefficient, with costs that had been rising steadily for the past decade. The current royal steward was elderly and set in his ways, resistant to change. Perhaps, Alexandra suggested, I might be interested in reviewing the household accounts. Not officially, of course. That would require approvals and committee formations that could take months, but informally, as a way to occupy my time, and possibly even make myself useful. I stared at him, uncertain if he was serious. He assured me he was. The palace had a library that contained years of financial records. I was welcome to examine them, to make observations, to suggest improvements if I found any. It would give me something productive to do. And who knew? Perhaps I would actually find ways to save money. It was such an unexpected offer that I found myself accepting before fully considering the implications. He seemed pleased by this, then suggested we should continue our walk before we were missed. As we strolled through the gardens, our conversation drifted to lighter topics. He asked about my life in London, and I found myself describing my home with a fondness I hadn't fully recognized before. The small drawing room where I would sit with my father in the evenings, the garden that was nothing compared to these palace grounds, but had been entirely my own to manage, the library that had been my retreat. In turn, he shared stories of his own childhood. Growing up in the palace had been both privileged and isolating. He and Leopold had been close as boys, creating elaborate games in these same gardens. But as they grew older, and Leopold's training as heir became more intensive, that closeness had faded into the formal relationship expected of them. He spoke with nostalgia about a simpler time, before duty and obligation had defined every aspect of his existence. I found myself understanding him better through these stories. He wasn't simply the prince who had accidentally married me, or the obstacle between me and my former life. He was a person, as trapped by circumstance as I was, trying to find meaning within the constraints of his position. We returned to the palace as the afternoon light began to fade, and he escorted me to the library he'd mentioned. It was smaller than the main library, tucked away in an older section of the palace. The books here were primarily records and ledgers, the accumulated financial history of the royal household. He showed me where different categories of records were kept, explaining the basic structure of the accounting system. As he was leaving, he paused at the door. He told me that he appreciated my willingness to try, that he knew none of this was fair to me. I acknowledged this, but also admitted that perhaps having a purpose might make the situation more bearable. He nodded, then said something that surprised me. He told me that if I found palace life truly unbearable, he would help me leave. Annulment, divorce, whatever was necessary. He wouldn't force me to remain in a situation I found intolerable, regardless of the political complications. I asked why he would do that, sacrifice his own reputation and political standing for someone he barely knew. His answer was simple but carried weight. Because it would be the right thing to do, he said, and because he suspected I deserved better than to be trapped in a marriage I never agreed to, regardless of how convenient it might be for everyone else. After he left, I stood in that library for a long time, surrounded by ledgers that represented years of royal expenditure. For the first time since arriving in Auvergne, I felt something other than dread or resentment. I felt curiosity. And perhaps, though I was hesitant to name it, the beginnings of respect for the man I had accidentally married. Over the following weeks, I spent hours in that library. The accounts were, as Alexandre had suggested, a mess. Duplicate expenditures, suppliers charging vastly different prices for identical goods, entire categories of spending that seemed to have no oversight whatsoever. I made notes, created charts, compared prices across years. It was meticulous work, often tedious, but I found it deeply satisfying. Madame Beaumont was baffled by my new hobby, but couldn't exactly object since I was still attending all required functions and lessons. The Queen Mother, when she learned of it, made a dismissive comment about me playing at accounting like a merchant's daughter, but I noticed that Alexandra's brother Leopold seemed genuinely interested, asking intelligent questions about what I was finding. And Alexandre himself began stopping by the library with increasing frequency. At first, he would simply check on my progress, but gradually our conversations expanded beyond finances. We discovered shared opinions on various court personalities. Our assessments of who was genuine and who was performing were remarkably aligned. We found we had similar tastes in literature, both preferring novels with complex characters over purely romantic or adventurous tales. We even shared a tendency toward sarcasm that we'd both learned to suppress in public but could indulge when alone together. It was during one of these conversations, perhaps a month after I'd begun my accounting project, that I looked up from a particularly egregious example of overspending and found him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I asked if something was wrong, and he smiled, shaking his head. He told me that he'd been thinking about our first meeting, that night at the ball, how I'd looked so thoroughly exhausted by social performance, how we'd talked honestly about the absurdity of formal society, how natural it had felt to have me simply sit beside him while he played. I remembered it too, I admitted. It had been the most genuine interaction I'd had at a social event in years. Everyone else had been performing, but he'd simply been himself. He suggested that perhaps we could try to recapture some of that honesty, that instead of being strangers forced into marriage, we could attempt to become friends. It wouldn't solve all the complications of our situation, but it might make it more bearable for both of us. I considered this carefully. Friendship seemed both safer and more dangerous than the formal distance we'd been maintaining. Safer because it gave us a foundation beyond political necessity. Dangerous because it made the eventual annulment, when it came, potentially more painful. But as I looked at him, standing among the financial records in the fading afternoon light, I found myself agreeing. We were already trapped in this situation together. We might as well try to find some companionship within it. He seemed relieved by my acceptance. Then, almost shyly, he asked if I would like to join him in the music room that evening. He'd been avoiding it since that first night, he admitted, but he missed playing, and he thought perhaps we might both enjoy an evening that wasn't filled with court formalities. I accepted without hesitation. That evening, I found my way to the music room, the same one from that first night, I realized. Alexandra was already there, and when he saw me, he gestured to the piano bench with the same casual welcome he'd offered at the ball. I sat beside him, and he began to play. Not Chopin this time, but Mozart, something light and playful that felt like a counterpoint to the seriousness of our daily lives. We didn't talk much, but the silence was comfortable rather than awkward. As the evening progressed and the music filled the room, I realized something that both comforted and alarmed me. I was beginning to like my accidental husband. More than like, I was beginning to understand him, to appreciate the person behind the princely facade. It was a dangerous realization, I knew. Feelings could complicate an already complicated situation. But as Alexandra transitioned into a duet and gestured for me to join him on the keys, I found I couldn't quite regret it. Perhaps this gilded cage was becoming slightly less confining. Or perhaps I was simply learning to find moments of freedom within it. Either way, for the first time since that fateful night at the ball, I felt something approaching contentment. It wouldn't last, of course. Contentment rarely did in my experience. But for that evening, sitting beside Alexandra in the music room, our fingers occasionally brushing on the keys, I allowed myself to simply exist in the moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new judgments, new evidence of my inadequacy. But tonight, I had found an unexpected ally in the most unlikely of places. And that, I was discovering, made all the difference. The friendship that developed between Alexandra and myself over the following months was perhaps the most unexpected aspect of my new life. We established a routine that existed in the margins of our official duties. Late evenings in the music room, afternoon walks in the gardens, quiet conversations in the library while I worked on the household accounts. These moments became sanctuaries from the performance required everywhere else in the palace. I presented my findings on the household expenditures to Alexandra in early summer, a comprehensive report that documented years of wasteful spending and proposed specific reforms. He read it with the kind of focused attention I'd rarely seen anyone give to financial matters, occasionally making notes or asking questions that demonstrated he understood not just the numbers, but their implications. When he finished, he looked at me with something close to awe. He told me the report was brilliant, that I'd identified problems even the royal auditors had missed. Then he asked if I would be willing to present my findings to the royal council. The prospect terrified me more than I wanted to admit. The council was composed of the kingdom's most powerful nobles and advisors, all men, none of whom had shown any inclination to take me seriously. But Alexandra assured me he would support my recommendations, and Leopold had already expressed interest in implementing reforms. The presentation took place on a humid afternoon in the council chamber, a room I'd never entered before. It was intimidating by design. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, portraits of previous monarchs whose painted eyes seemed to follow every movement. The council members sat in a semicircle, and I stood before them like a defendant awaiting judgment. I spoke for nearly an hour, walking them through my analysis with the same precision I'd used in preparing the report. Some council members listened attentively, others looked skeptical. A few appeared openly dismissive, as if my presence were an affront to the dignity of their assembly. When I finished, there was a moment of silence before the questions began. Some were genuine inquiries about methodology or implementation. Others were thinly veiled challenges to my authority or expertise. The royal treasurer, an elderly man named Count Rothstein who had held his position for 30 years, was particularly hostile. He suggested that I didn't understand the complexities of royal finance, that my recommendations were naive and potentially dangerous. I responded calmly, citing specific examples from the records and explaining exactly why current practices were unsustainable. Alexandra supported my arguments when appropriate, adding political context I might have missed. Leopold did the same, and I was grateful for their intervention, even as I resented needing it. The meeting ended without any firm decisions, which Alexandra told me afterward was actually a positive outcome. The council would review my recommendations and vote on implementation at their next session. For a proposal to not be immediately rejected was apparently a small victory. But that evening, as I prepared for yet another formal dinner, I felt the weight of what I'd done. I had inserted myself into matters of state, overstepped the decorative role everyone expected of me. The Queen Mother would undoubtedly be displeased. The court would have more ammunition for their gossip, and Count Rothstein, I suspected, would not easily forgive being challenged in his own domain. I was correct on all counts. The whispers began almost immediately. At dinner that night, I overheard fragments of conversation from nearby courtiers, speculating about my presumption, questioning my motives, suggesting I was trying to gain undue influence over Alexandra. Isabel was particularly vocal, commenting loudly enough for me to hear that some people didn't understand their proper place. The Queen Mother said nothing directly to me, but her silence was perhaps more condemning than any words could have been. She looked at me throughout dinner with an expression of cold disapproval that made clear I had crossed a line. Only Alexandra and Leopold seemed unconcerned by the controversy. Leopold went so far as to toast my presentation at dinner, praising my thoroughness and insight. Alexandra's support was quieter but no less meaningful, sitting beside me, engaging me in conversation, making clear through his attention that he valued my contribution. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stood at my window, looking out at the darkened gardens, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. Perhaps I should have remained decorative and silent, accepting my role until the annulment could be arranged. Instead, I had drawn attention to myself, created enemies, given ammunition to those who already questioned my presence. A soft knock at my door interrupted these thoughts. When I opened it, I found Alexandra standing in the corridor, still formally dressed, but looking as tired as I felt. He asked if he could come in, and I hesitated only briefly before agreeing. We both knew it was improper, but propriety seemed a minor concern given everything else. He told me he'd been worried about me, that he knew the evening had been difficult. I admitted I was questioning whether presenting my findings had been wise, whether I'd made things worse for both of us. His response surprised me. He said that what I'd done was necessary, not just for the household finances, but for me, that I'd been slowly disappearing these past months, trying to fit myself into a role that didn't suit me. Seeing me speak with authority and passion today had reminded him of the woman who'd fallen asleep on his shoulder, exhausted by performance, genuine in a way that was rare in court life. I told him I appreciated his support, but wondered at what cost. The Queen Mother was furious. The court was scandalized. Count Rothstein would almost certainly oppose any future suggestion I made. Alexandra moved to stand beside me at the window, looking out at the same view. He acknowledged these concerns but suggested they were worth it. The kingdom needed reform, and I had identified crucial problems that others had either missed or ignored. If we backed down now simply because it was controversial, nothing would ever change. We stood in silence for several moments, the space between us charged with something I was hesitant to name. Finally, he spoke again, his voice softer than before. He told me that he'd been meaning to say something for weeks but hadn't found the right moment, that he was grateful for how I'd handled this impossible situation, that I'd exceeded every expectation in ways he hadn't thought possible. I turned to look at him, and found him already watching me. In the moonlight, his expression was unguarded in a way it rarely was. I thanked him for his confidence, my voice barely above a whisper, suddenly aware of how alone we were, how improper this late-night visit would appear if discovered. He seemed to realize the same thing. He stepped back, apologizing for the intrusion and the late hour. But before he left, he took my hand briefly, a gesture that was somehow both formal and intimate. He told me that whatever happened with the council, whatever the court said, he wanted me to know that he was proud of what I'd accomplished. After he left, I returned to the window, my hand still warm where he'd held it. Something was shifting between us, something beyond friendship or alliance. I'd been trying not to acknowledge it, telling myself that any feelings beyond cordial cooperation were dangerous and impractical. But standing there in the darkness, I could no longer deny what I'd been feeling for weeks. I was falling in love with my accidental husband. The realization should have alarmed me. We'd both spoken of eventual annulment, of returning to our separate lives once the political situation allowed. Developing genuine feelings complicated everything, but I found I couldn't quite regret it, even knowing the potential heartbreak ahead. The following weeks brought new challenges that pushed my personal revelations to the background. The Royal Council reconvened to discuss my recommendations, and the debate was contentious. Count Rothstein had rallied opposition, arguing that implementing my suggestions would undermine traditions and upset long-standing arrangements with various suppliers and contractors. What became clear during these debates was that many of the inefficiencies I'd identified were actually intentional. Various nobles held contracts with the royal household, charging inflated prices in exchange for political support. The waste I'd documented wasn't incompetence. It was corruption, a system of patronage that benefited the powerful at the expense of the crown's finances. Alexandra and Leopold pushed for implementation despite this opposition. The debates grew heated, with accusations and counter-accusations. I wasn't present for these council sessions, but Alexandra would tell me afterward how the arguments progressed, his frustration evident. It was during one of these tense periods that things took a darker turn. Rumors began circulating about Alexandra, whispers that he'd been mismanaging certain diplomatic funds, that there were irregularities in accounts under his supervision. The accusations were vague but damaging, gaining traction among those already opposed to reform. Alexandra dismissed them initially as political maneuvering, attempts by Rothstein and his allies to distract from their own corruption. But the rumors persisted, growing more specific and more damaging. Someone was actively working to undermine his credibility. I was in the library late one evening, reviewing older financial records to see if I could identify the source of the accusations, when Leopold arrived unexpectedly. His expression was grave, and I knew immediately that something serious had happened. He told me that formal charges had been brought against Alexandre before the council. Someone had produced documents suggesting Alexandre had diverted funds intended for diplomatic missions into private accounts. The evidence appeared legitimate, complete with signatures and official seals. My first reaction was absolute certainty that the charges were false. I'd spent months studying the household accounts, and I knew Alexandre's personal integrity. He might be many things, but a thief wasn't among them. Leopold agreed, but noted that public perception mattered more than truth in cases like this. If the charges gained credence, Alexandre could be forced to abdicate his succession rights, possibly even face exile. I asked who would benefit from destroying Alexandre's reputation. Leopold's answer was enlightening and disturbing. Count Rothstein, certainly. Removing Alexandra would eliminate the primary advocate for financial reform. But there was someone else who had even more to gain. Leopold's uncle, the Duc de Montfort, had long believed he should have a greater role in governance. With Alexandra discredited and Leopold focused on his duties as crown prince, the Duke could position himself as chief advisor to the throne. And then there was Isabel. She'd been publicly humiliated by Alexandra's marriage to me. Her expected engagement transformed into scandal. She had ties to both Rothstein and the Duke. If she was involved in this conspiracy, it would explain the personal nature of some attacks. I asked Leopold what could be done. He admitted the situation was delicate. They needed to prove the documents were forgeries without triggering a larger political crisis. They needed to identify who was behind the conspiracy without making accusations they couldn't substantiate. I studied the copies of the incriminating documents Leopold had brought. Something about them nagged at me, a familiarity I couldn't quite place. Then it struck me. The accounting format was similar to records I'd seen in the older ledgers, a system that had been replaced several years ago. Whoever forged these documents had based them on outdated templates. It was a small detail, but it suggested the forger had access to historical records. Someone who could move freely through the palace archives. Someone with both motive and opportunity. Over the following days, I spent every available moment investigating, using the access to records that my household accounting project had given me. Alexandre was consumed with defending himself before the council, providing documentation of every diplomatic expense. Leopold worked political channels, trying to maintain support among wavering nobles. I focused on the paper trail. I compared signatures, analyzed accounting formats, cross-referenced dates, and slowly, a picture emerged. The forgeries were sophisticated but not perfect. Small inconsistencies in formatting, slight variations in signature pressure that suggested tracing rather than authentic signing. And crucially, the alleged private accounts listed addresses that corresponded to properties owned by the Duc de Montfort. But I needed more than circumstantial evidence. I needed proof of the conspiracy itself. That proof came from an unexpected source. One of the younger clerks in the royal archives, a man named Henri who I'd befriended during my research, approached me nervously one afternoon. He told me he'd seen Isabelle in the archives several weeks prior, an unusual occurrence since nobles rarely visited such spaces. She'd been particularly interested in old financial records, the same period I'd identified as the source of the forged templates. Henri hadn't thought much of it at the time, but given current events, he wondered if it might be relevant. I assured him it was very relevant indeed and asked if he could identify exactly which records she'd accessed. With his help, I documented Isabelle's visits, the specific ledgers she'd examined, and the correlation between those records and the forged documents. It still wasn't conclusive proof, but it was enough to establish a connection. I brought my findings to Leopold, who immediately understood their significance. He arranged for a private meeting with Alexandra, myself, and the palace's chief legal advisor. I presented my analysis, showing the inconsistencies in the forged documents, the connection to obsolete accounting formats, and Isabelle's unusual interest in historical records. The legal advisor studied my evidence carefully, then confirmed that it would be sufficient to raise reasonable doubt about the charges. But Alexander wanted more than doubt. He wanted to expose the conspiracy fully, to ensure those responsible faced consequences. Leopold agreed, but noted they needed to be strategic. Direct accusations against a duke and a duchess without absolute proof could trigger a political crisis. I suggested a different approach. Rather than making accusations, we could set a trap. If we could make the conspirators believe their plan was succeeding, they might expose themselves further. The plan was risky, but simple. Alexandra would appear to accept responsibility for the alleged improprieties, offering to step back from succession considerations pending a full investigation. This would make the conspirators confident, possibly careless. Meanwhile, we would conduct our own investigation with the full resources of the crown. Alexandra hated the idea of appearing guilty, but he agreed it was the best path forward. The announcement was made the following day. Alexandra would temporarily suspend his royal duties while allegations were investigated. The court reacted with shock and speculation. The Queen Mother was furious, though whether at Alexandre or the situation itself was unclear. Isabelle's reaction, however, was telling. She didn't merely appear satisfied, she appeared triumphant. Within days, she was openly discussing Alexandra's downfall with her circle, suggesting that his marriage to an unsuitable English girl had clouded his judgment and led to poor decisions. But she made a critical mistake. In her confidence, she let slip details about the alleged financial improprieties that had never been made public, details that only someone involved in creating the false evidence would know. Leopold's agents documented these conversations carefully. Combined with my analysis of the forgeries and Henri's testimony about the archive visits, a clear picture of the conspiracy emerged. Isabelle had worked with Count Rothstein and the Duke to create false evidence against Alexandra, intending to force his removal from succession and position themselves to profit from the resulting chaos. The confrontation took place in the council chamber, with all major nobles present. Leopold, as Crown Prince, presented the evidence methodically, the forged documents and their inconsistencies, the connection to obsolete templates, Isabelle's suspicious archive visits, her knowledge of unpublished details about the charges. Isabelle denied everything initially, her composure remarkable even under accusation. But when confronted with specific dates, times, and witnesses, her facade began to crack. Count Rothstein attempted to bluster his way through, but the evidence was overwhelming. The Duc de Montfort, notably, had been careful to maintain some distance from the actual forgeries. But his connection to the alleged private accounts and his political motives were sufficient to implicate him in the broader conspiracy. The council's judgment was swift. Isabelle was stripped of her titles and exiled from court. Count Rothstein was removed from his position, and placed under house arrest pending criminal proceedings. The Duc de Montfort was formally censured and removed from all advisory positions, his political influence effectively destroyed. Alexandre was completely exonerated, his reputation restored, and my household accounting recommendations, having been proven correct in identifying the corruption that enabled the conspiracy, were approved for immediate implementation. In the aftermath, as the court adjusted to this new reality, Alexandre found me in the library, where I'd spent so many hours uncovering the truth. He looked exhausted but relieved. The weight of false accusation finally lifted. He told me that I'd saved him, that without my investigation and analysis, the conspiracy might have succeeded. I deflected the praise, noting that Leopold and his legal advisors had been equally crucial, but Alexandre wouldn't let me minimize my role. He took my hands in his expression more serious than I'd ever seen it. He said that I'd proven myself far more capable than any of the nobles who'd questioned my presence at court, that I'd shown courage and intelligence in defending someone who, by all rights, I should have resented for trapping me in this life. I told him the truth, that at some point over these months, he'd stopped being the prince who'd accidentally married me and become someone I genuinely cared about, someone worth defending not from obligation, but from choice. His hands tightened on mine, and I saw in his eyes the same feelings I'd been trying to suppress in myself. But before either of us could say more, we were interrupted by a summons to dinner with the royal family. The evening that followed was remarkable for its warmth. The Queen Mother, for the first time since my arrival, addressed me with something approaching respect. She acknowledged that my investigation had protected the Crown's interests and suggested that perhaps she had underestimated my capabilities. It wasn't quite an apology, but from her, it was nearly equivalent. Leopold toasted my success publicly, and this time, no one in the court whispered criticism. I had proven myself in terms they understood, not through perfect curtsies or flawless protocol, but through intelligence and determination in defense of the Crown. That night, as I prepared for bed, I reflected on how far I'd come from that frightened girl who'd woken in a carriage bound for an unknown country. I'd found purpose in this accidental life. I'd made genuine friends in Leopold and Maria. I'd earned a measure of respect from a court that had initially dismissed me. And most significantly, I'd fallen completely in love with the man I'd married in a fog of sleep and circumstance. The question now was what to do about it. We'd successfully navigated crisis and conspiracy, but we'd never addressed the fundamental question of our marriage. Was it still meant to be temporary? Or had something changed that made permanence possible, even desirable? These thoughts occupied me as I stood at my window, looking out at the gardens where Alexandre and I had first begun to understand each other. Somewhere in those months, the gilded cage had transformed. It was still constraining in many ways, but it was also becoming something like home. And the prince who'd been my accidental husband was becoming the man I couldn't imagine living without. The weeks following the exposure of the conspiracy brought changes to palace life that I wouldn't have thought possible. The implementation of my financial reforms proceeded with surprising efficiency, no longer hampered by those who had profited from the old system. Count Rothstein's replacement, a younger man named Viscount Beaufort, proved remarkably competent and actually welcomed my suggestions. The Queen Mother, while still not warm, had shifted from outright hostility to something approaching grudging acceptance. Even the court's attitude had changed. I was no longer the unsuitable English girl who'd trapped their prince, but rather the clever foreigner who'd saved him from disgrace. But these external changes paled in comparison to the internal shift happening between Alexandre and myself. Something had fundamentally altered during those tense weeks of investigation and vindication. The careful friendship we'd cultivated had deepened into something neither of us seemed quite ready to name, though it colored every interaction, every glance, every accidental touch. We'd fallen into a routine that was both comfortable and charged with unspoken tension. Mornings were dedicated to our separate duties. He to diplomatic correspondence and council meetings, I to the ongoing work of implementing household reforms and attending the social obligations required of a princess. But evenings belonged to us. We would meet in the music room, or walk in the gardens, or simply sit in the library discussing everything from literature to politics to the absurdities of court life. These conversations had become the center of my day, the moments I looked forward to with an anticipation that was both thrilling and terrifying, because I could feel us approaching something inevitable, a reckoning we'd been avoiding since that first night, when he'd held my hand and told me he was proud of me. It was Maria, Crown Princess and Leopold's wife, who finally addressed what everyone seemed to notice except Alexandra and myself. She'd invited me to join her for afternoon tea in her private sitting room, a casual invitation that nonetheless felt significant. Maria had been unfailingly kind since my arrival, but we'd never spent time alone together. Her sitting room was smaller and more intimate than the formal spaces I was accustomed to, decorated with personal touches that made it feel lived in rather than merely ornamental. She poured tea with her own hands, dismissing the servants, and I understood that this conversation was meant to be private. She began carefully, commenting on how well I seemed to have adapted to palace life. I thanked her, though we both knew adaptation wasn't quite the right word for what had happened. She smiled knowingly, then asked a question that caught me off guard. She wondered if I'd given any thought to making my position permanent. I must have looked confused because she clarified. The annulment that had been discussed when I first arrived. Had Alexandra mentioned it recently? Because from her observations, neither he nor I seemed particularly interested in pursuing it anymore. I set down my teacup carefully, buying time to formulate a response. I admitted that the subject hadn't been raised in months, but neither had any alternative arrangement been discussed. We existed in a strange limbo, legally married but theoretically temporary. Maria regarded me with an expression of gentle amusement. She suggested that perhaps it was time someone acknowledged the obvious, that Alexandra and I had developed feelings that went well beyond the requirements of our accidental marriage, that the entire court could see it, even if we seemed determined to pretend otherwise. I wanted to deny it, to maintain the pretense of mere friendship and mutual respect, but Maria's kindness made dishonesty feel impossible. I confessed that I had developed feelings for Alexandra, feelings that complicated an already complicated situation, but I had no idea if he felt the same, and I was terrified to discover the answer either way. Maria's laugh was soft but genuine. She assured me that Alexandra's feelings were quite obvious to everyone except, apparently, me. The way he looked at me during state dinners, how he found excuses to seek my opinion on matters. The fact that he'd been postponing meetings with potential annulment lawyers for months, always finding some reason why the timing wasn't right. She leaned forward, her expression becoming more serious. She told me that she understood my hesitation, having married into the royal family herself. The loss of privacy, the constant scrutiny, the weight of expectations. It wasn't an easy life, but it could be a good life with the right partner. And from what she'd observed, Alexandra and I had something rare, genuine partnership built on mutual respect and shared values. I asked her what I should do. The question felt absurd coming from a grown woman, but I genuinely didn't know how to proceed. Maria's advice was simple, but daunting. She suggested I talk to him, actually talk, about feelings and futures, and what we both wanted from this marriage that neither of us had chosen, but both seemed reluctant to end. That evening, I went to the music room at our usual time with Maria's words echoing in my mind. Alexandre was already there, and the sight of him seated at the piano filled me with the now familiar combination of warmth and anxiety that his presence inspired. He greeted me with the smile that had become my favorite, genuine and unguarded, so different from the formal expression he wore in public. He asked if I wanted to play, and I shook my head, suddenly nervous about what I was about to do. I told him we needed to talk, and something in my tone must have conveyed the seriousness, because he immediately stood, his expression shifting to concern. He asked if something was wrong, and I almost laughed at the question. Everything was wrong, or everything was right, depending on perspective. I asked him about the annulment, whether he'd made any progress on the legal proceedings, whether he'd consulted with lawyers about the timeline. The questions came out more abruptly than I'd intended, lacking all the careful phrasing I'd rehearsed. Alexandra looked genuinely startled. He admitted he hadn't pursued it recently, that the political situation had been too unstable for such a public acknowledgement of our marriage's unusual circumstances. But his tone suggested this was an excuse rather than the full truth. I pressed him. I asked if he wanted the annulment, if he was still planning to give me back the life that had been taken from me, as he'd promised months ago. He was silent for a long moment, his expression difficult to read. Then he asked me a question in return. Did I want the annulment? Was I still desperate to return to my old life in England? I realized we were circling around the real conversation, both too afraid to speak plainly. So I forced myself to be brave in a way that had nothing to do with facing down conspiracies or hostile courts. I told him the truth. I admitted that somewhere between that first terrible dinner and the night he'd thanked me for my investigation, I'd stopped wanting to leave. That my old life, which I'd thought I'd desperately missed, now seemed small and constrained compared to what I'd found here. Not the palace or the title, but the purpose I'd discovered, the friendships I'd formed, and most significantly, the partnership I'd built with him. I confessed that I'd fallen in love with him, though I hadn't meant to, and wasn't sure when it had happened, that I understood if he didn't feel the same, that our marriage had been forced on both of us, and he had every right to want freedom from it. But I needed to know where we stood, because living in uncertainty was becoming unbearable. The silence that followed my confession felt endless. Alexandra stared at me with an expression I couldn't interpret, and I felt my courage begin to crumble. I'd miscalculated, revealed feelings that weren't reciprocated, made everything impossibly awkward. Then he crossed the distance between us in 3 strides and kissed me. It wasn't tentative or questioning. It was certain and passionate, and spoke of feelings that had been restrained for far too long. When he finally pulled back, his hands still framing my face, his expression was a mixture of relief and wonder, and something that looked remarkably like joy. He told me he'd been in love with me for months, possibly since that first day in the gardens, when I'd admitted to feeling useless, and he'd seen the fierce intelligence beneath my frustrated surface, that he'd been terrified to tell me, because I'd been so clear about wanting to return to England, about viewing our marriage as temporary. That every day he'd postponed the annulment proceedings was another day he could pretend we might have a future together. I asked him why he hadn't said anything, why he'd let me believe he still wanted to end our marriage. His answer was achingly honest. He'd been afraid that if he revealed his feelings, I would feel obligated to reciprocate out of gratitude or duty. That I would stay, not because I wanted to, but because I felt I owed him something for defending me against his mother in the court. I told him he was an idiot. Perhaps not the most romantic response, but it made him laugh. I explained that I'd been terrified of revealing my own feelings for precisely the opposite reason, that he would feel obligated to maintain our marriage out of chivalry, trapped by the same protective instinct that had created this situation in the first place. We'd both been so busy protecting each other that we'd nearly destroyed our chance at happiness together. Alexandra kissed me again, softer this time, but no less meaningful. When we finally separated, he took my hands in his expression becoming serious despite the lingering smile. He told me that if we were going to truly commit to this marriage, it needed to be a real choice, not an accident or a political necessity. He wanted to do things properly. He wanted to court me the way he would have if we'd met under normal circumstances, to give me the romance and certainty I deserved. The formality of his proposal was so perfectly Alexandra that I couldn't help but smile. I pointed out that we were already married, that courtship seemed a bit backwards at this stage. He acknowledged this but remained serious. He said that our first wedding had been done to me, not with me. If we were going to make this permanent, he wanted to renew our vows in a ceremony that actually meant something, one where I walked down the aisle fully awake and entirely certain of what I was choosing. The offer moved me more than I'd expected. He was giving me the choice that had been taken away, the opportunity to enter this marriage with full consciousness and consent. It was perhaps the most romantic thing anyone had ever offered me. I told him yes. Yes to courtship. Yes to a real wedding. Yes to making this accidental marriage into a deliberate choice. His kiss in response was answer enough, but when we finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, he added something that made my heart soar. He said he'd fallen in love with me that very first night, watching me sleep on his shoulder while he played Chopin. That even then, before scandal or conspiracy or any of the complications that followed, he'd felt something shift, that some part of him had already known she was someone extraordinary. I laughed and told him that was terribly presumptuous, falling in love with someone while they slept. He grinned, unrepentant, and suggested that perhaps our entire relationship had been defined by presumption, him presuming to announce our engagement, me presuming to reform his household accounts, both of us presuming we could maintain emotional distance while living in close quarters. We spent the rest of the evening in that music room, talking with the kind of honesty we'd been denying ourselves for months. He told me about the fear he'd felt when the conspiracy threatened not just his reputation, but any future with me. How the weeks of investigation had been bearable only because we were facing them together. How he'd realized during that time that he didn't just want me in his life. He needed me there. I shared my own journey from resentment to acceptance to something far deeper. How I'd fought against caring for him because it felt like surrender, like accepting a fate I hadn't chosen. How I'd finally realized that choosing him now, with full knowledge and consciousness, was entirely different from the accident that had brought us together. When I finally returned to my apartments that night, escorted by Alexandra with a propriety that felt charmingly absurd, given that we'd been married for months, I felt lighter than I had since arriving in Auvergne. The uncertainty that had colored every interaction was gone, replaced by the solid certainty of mutual feeling and shared choice. The following days brought a flurry of activity as Alexandra made good on his promise of proper courtship. Despite already being married, despite living in the same palace and seeing each other daily, he approached our relationship with the formality of a man wooing a woman properly. There were flowers delivered to my apartments each morning, not the elaborate formal arrangements typical of court life, but simpler bouquets of wildflowers from the palace gardens, the kind I'd mentioned preferring during one of our conversations. There were handwritten notes, brief but genuine, often quoting passages from books we'd discussed, or making observations about palace life that only I would appreciate. He arranged private dinners, just the two of us, in smaller, more intimate spaces than the grand dining rooms where we usually performed our roles. We talked for hours, discovering new depths to each other's characters, sharing stories from our pasts, discussing our hopes for the future. The court noticed, of course. How could they not? The change in dynamic between us was obvious to anyone paying attention, but the whispers now were speculative rather than critical. There was talk of a formal renewal of vows, of plans for a proper wedding celebration. Even the Queen Mother seemed resigned, if not entirely pleased by the development. It was Leopold who finally addressed the elephant in the room during a private family dinner approximately 2 weeks after Alexandra and I had confessed our feelings. He raised his wine glass and announced that it was time to stop pretending this marriage was temporary, that clearly Alexandra and I had decided to make it permanent, and the family should formally acknowledge and celebrate this. The Queen Mother's expression suggested she'd known this moment was coming but wasn't entirely happy about it. However, to my surprise, she didn't object. Instead, she asked me directly if this was what I truly wanted, not what was expected or convenient, but what I actually desired. I met her gaze steadily and told her the truth. I said that I hadn't chosen to come to Auvergne, hadn't chosen to marry her son, but I was choosing to stay, choosing to commit to this marriage and this life, with full awareness and absolute certainty. Something shifted in her expression. She told me that she'd been wrong about me, that she'd underestimated both my capability and my character, that while she still believed Alexandra could have made a more strategically advantageous match, she could see that what he'd found instead was perhaps more valuable, a true partner who challenged and supported him equally. It wasn't effusive praise, but from her, it was remarkable. Alexandra reached for my hand under the table, squeezing it gently. Leopold suggested we plan a proper wedding ceremony to take place in 2 months, giving time for preparations and for invitations to be sent to foreign dignitaries. This would be our public declaration, the moment when an accidental marriage became a chosen commitment. Maria added that I should have the wedding I wanted, not what protocol demanded. If I preferred a smaller ceremony to a grand state affair, that could be arranged. If I wanted specific traditions honored or others discarded, I should feel free to make those decisions. The kindness of the offer moved me. For the first time since arriving in Auvergne, I was being given genuine choice about something significant. Over the following weeks, as plans for the ceremony took shape, I found myself appreciating the symbolism of what we were doing. Our first wedding had been conducted while I slept, without my knowledge or consent. This second wedding would be the opposite. Fully conscious, entirely deliberate, a public affirmation of a choice we'd both made freely. Alexandra was involved in every decision, insisting that this wedding belonged to both of us, rather than being orchestrated around me. We chose music together, including the Chopin nocturne he'd been playing the night we met. We selected readings that reflected our shared values. We even wrote our own vows, words that acknowledged the unusual path we'd traveled to reach this point. The night before the ceremony, Alexandra found me in the music room where so much of our relationship had unfolded. He told me that I could still change my mind, that he would understand if the reality of permanently committing to this life felt overwhelming, that he loved me enough to let me go if that was what I needed. I assured him that changing my mind was the last thing I wanted, that I'd spent months fighting against caring for him, months trying to maintain distance and emotional safety, that I was done fighting, done protecting myself from the best thing that had ever accidentally happened to me. He smiled at that, the genuine, unguarded smile that I'd come to treasure. Then he kissed me goodnight with a promise that the next time we kissed, it would be as husband and wife by choice, not accident. As I lay in bed that night, thinking about the ceremony tomorrow, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me here. I'd fallen asleep on a stranger's shoulder at a ball and woken up married to a prince. I'd been angry and resentful and utterly lost. But somehow, in the process of trying to find my way back to my old life, I'd discovered something better, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine love. Tomorrow, I would walk down an aisle fully awake. I would speak vows with complete consciousness. I would choose Alexandra in this life, not because circumstances forced me to, but because there was nowhere else I wanted to be, and no one else I wanted to be with. The accidental princess was becoming something more, a woman who had found love in the most unlikely of places, and had the courage to embrace it fully. The morning of our wedding ceremony dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through my windows with what felt like deliberate symbolism. I woke early, not from anxiety, but from anticipation, a feeling so different from the dread that had characterized my first weeks in Auvergne that it was almost startling. Maria arrived shortly after breakfast, with a small army of attendants, but her presence transformed what could have been an impersonal preparation into something intimate and meaningful. She'd brought champagne and dismissed most of the servants, keeping only those essential for the elaborate process of dressing a bride. As they worked on my hair, Maria sat beside me, offering the kind of easy conversation that calmed nerves I hadn't quite acknowledged having. She told me about her own wedding to Leopold, how terrified she'd been to marry into the royal family, how she'd wondered if she would lose herself in the requirements of her position, but she'd found that having a partner who truly saw her, not just the princess but the person, made all the difference. I understood what she was saying, what she was offering, reassurance that the choice I was making, while permanent, wasn't a surrender of self, but rather an expansion of it, that I could be both Catherine and the Princess of Auvergne, that these identities could coexist rather than compete. The dress they'd prepared was exquisite, simpler than the elaborate confection I'd worn at formal court events, but more elegant for its restraint. Cream silk embroidered with delicate silver thread, the pattern suggesting the wildflowers Alexandra had been sending to my room each morning. It felt like me in a way that formal court attire never had, a perfect representation of the balance I was learning to strike between authenticity and obligation. When I was finally ready, Maria handed me a small box. Inside was a pendant, a single pearl on a silver chain, elegant and understated. She explained that it had belonged to her grandmother, a woman who'd also married into royalty from outside, and who'd advised Maria on her own wedding day. She wanted me to have it as a reminder that I wasn't the first woman to navigate these complicated waters, and that it was possible to do so without losing oneself. I fastened it around my neck, touched by the gesture and what it represented. Maria was welcoming me not just into the family, but into a lineage of women who'd faced similar challenges, and survived them with grace and strength. Leopold arrived to escort me to the chapel, and his warm smile did much to settle my remaining nerves. He offered his arm, and told me that Alexandra had been pacing the chapel for the past hour, alternating between excitement and terror that I might change my mind. I assured him that changing my mind was impossible. I'd spent too many months arriving at this decision to waver now. The walk through the palace corridors to the chapel felt surreal. Staff we passed stopped their work to smile or bow, but their expressions held genuine warmth rather than mere protocol. Word had spread throughout the palace about the nature of this ceremony, that it was a choice rather than an obligation, and somehow that made it matter to people beyond just court politics. At the chapel doors, Leopold paused. He told me quietly that he'd watched Alexandre struggle for years with the loneliness of his position, the sense that any relationship would be based on what he represented rather than who he actually was, that seeing him find genuine partnership with someone who challenged and matched him had been remarkable to witness. He thanked me for making his brother happy. The words settled something in me, a final confirmation that this wasn't just my story, or Alexandra's, but something that had rippled outward, affecting those around us in ways I was only beginning to understand. The chapel doors opened, and music swelled, not the traditional processional march, but the Chopin nocturne that had been playing the night we met. The symbolism was almost too perfect, taking me from that first accidental meeting to this deliberate commitment. The chapel itself was smaller than I'd expected, intimate rather than grand. Rows of seats held only close family and friends, Leopold and Maria, the Queen Mother, a handful of nobles who'd proven themselves genuine allies rather than mere courtiers. This wasn't a state spectacle, but a personal ceremony, witnessed by those who actually mattered. And at the front, waiting beside the priest, was Alexandra. He'd always been handsome, but seeing him now, in formal attire that emphasized his bearing, his expression unguarded with emotion as he watched me approach, took my breath away. More than his appearance, it was the way he looked at me, as if I were the only person in the room, the only person who mattered, as if this moment was one he'd been waiting for far longer than just the 2 months since we'd confessed our feelings. I walked down the aisle alone, a deliberate choice. This wasn't my father giving me away, or anyone else granting permission. This was me, choosing freely, walking toward a future I wanted rather than one imposed upon me. When I reached Alexandra, he took my hands in his, and I could feel the slight tremor that betrayed his emotion. The priest began the ceremony with words about the sacred nature of marriage, about commitment and partnership. But it was the moment for our personal vows that mattered most. Alexandra spoke first, his voice steady, despite the emotion I could see in his eyes. He acknowledged the unusual circumstances of our first wedding, how it had been born from accident and good intentions rather than genuine choice. He admitted that he'd been terrified I would never forgive him for inadvertently trapping me in a life I hadn't chosen. But he thanked me for giving him the chance to prove that what had begun as accident could transform into something deliberate and precious. He promised to honor my independence, to value my intelligence, to never take for granted the choice I was making today. He vowed to be not just my husband but my partner, to share both the burdens and joys of our position, and he promised that every day he would strive to be worthy of the gift I was giving him, my conscious, deliberate, freely chosen love. By the time he finished, my eyes were damp, and I didn't care who saw. When it was my turn to speak, I found my voice steadier than I'd expected, strengthened by the certainty of what I was saying. I acknowledged that I'd arrived in Auvergne angry and resentful, determined to maintain emotional distance until I could escape. I confessed that falling in love with him had been the last thing I'd intended, a complication I'd fought against with every bit of stubbornness I possessed. But I'd learned that sometimes the best things in life were the ones we didn't plan for, the accidents that revealed themselves to be exactly where we were meant to be. I promised to challenge him when I thought he was wrong, to support him when he was right, and to never pretend agreement simply because it was easier. I vowed to be honest even when honesty was uncomfortable, to bring all of myself to our partnership rather than just the parts that were convenient or appropriate. And I promised that every day I would choose him again, not because I was obligated to, but because there was no one else I would rather choose. When I finished, Alexandra's expression held so much emotion that I knew he was as moved as I was. The priest continued with the traditional elements of the ceremony, blessing our union and proclaiming us husband and wife. But when he invited Alexandra to kiss his bride, there was nothing traditional about the way Alexandra pulled me close, kissing me with a passion that probably scandalized the Queen Mother, but drew quiet cheers from Leopold and Maria. When we finally broke apart, both smiling, the priest formally presented us to the small gathering, but the applause that followed felt more celebratory than formal, genuine happiness for a couple who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances. The celebration that followed was intimate rather than grand, a dinner with just family and close friends, conversation flowing easily, laughter genuine rather than polite. The Queen Mother, remarkably, had relaxed her usual rigid composure enough to offer a toast that acknowledged my perseverance and eventual success in finding my place within the family. But it was later that evening, after the dinner had concluded and most guests had retired, that the true significance of the day settled over me. Alexandra and I slipped away from the lingering celebration to the music room, drawn there by unspoken agreement. He sat at the piano, and I settled beside him on the bench as I had that very first night. But everything was different now. Then, We'd been strangers. Now, we were partners who'd chosen each other fully and completely. He began to play, not Chopin this time, but something new, a piece I didn't recognize. When I asked what it was, he admitted with almost shy embarrassment that he'd composed it. Over the past weeks, as we'd planned the ceremony, he'd found himself working out melodies that captured how he felt about me, about us, about the journey we'd taken together. The music was beautiful, alternating between melancholy and joy, uncertainty and resolution. It was our story told in notes rather than words, and listening to it, I felt tears slide down my cheeks unchecked. When he finished, he turned to me, wiping away my tears with gentle fingers. He asked if I was happy, and I laughed through the tears, assuring him I was happier than I'd known was possible. He told me then something he'd been wanting to say but hadn't found the right moment for, that the night we met, when I'd fallen asleep on his shoulder, he'd experienced a moment of perfect contentment he hadn't felt in years, the simple trust of a stranger, the absence of performance or obligation, the permission to simply be himself while playing music he loved. That moment had been the beginning of everything, even though neither of us had known it. I confessed that I'd felt safe that night in a way I couldn't explain, that despite being exhausted and overwhelmed by the evening's social demands, something about his music and his presence had made it feel acceptable to lower my guard, that even then, some part of me must have recognized something essential about him. We sat there in the music room as night deepened, talking with the kind of openness that felt both natural and precious. He told me about his fears for our future, the pressures that would continue to come from his position, the scrutiny we would face, the challenges of maintaining authenticity in a world that valued appearance over substance. But he also shared his hopes, that we could build something genuine together, that my presence would make navigating those pressures bearable, that we could perhaps even change some of the more ridiculous aspects of court life from within. I shared my own uncertainties. Despite everything I'd accomplished, I still sometimes felt like an imposter playing at being a princess. I worried about living up to expectations, about disappointing people who'd begun to believe in me. But I also told him that having him beside me made those fears manageable, that knowing we faced them together transformed everything. As the clock struck midnight, marking the end of our wedding day, Alexandra took my hand and led me to the windows overlooking the gardens. The moon was full, casting silver light over the carefully manicured landscape where we'd had so many crucial conversations. He told me that he wanted to make me a promise beyond the vows we'd spoken in the chapel. He promised that no matter what challenges came, no matter how difficult palace life became, he would always protect the core of who I was. That he'd fallen in love with Catherine Ashford, intelligent, stubborn, occasionally irreverent Catherine, and he never wanted me to feel I had to hide those qualities to be the Princess of Auvergne. I promised him the same, that I saw him, Alexandra, not just the prince or the title, that I would always remind him of who he was beneath the crown and the expectations, that we would protect each other's authenticity, even as we fulfilled our obligations. We sealed these promises with a kiss that felt like the beginning of something even more significant than what we'd celebrated today. The wedding had been a public declaration, but this felt like a private vow, spoken in the space that had become uniquely ours. When we finally left the music room and walked together toward our apartments, no longer separated by protocol now that we were officially and deliberately married, I felt the weight of everything that had happened settle into something like peace. I'd fallen asleep on a stranger's shoulder and woken up married. I'd been angry and lost and determined to escape. But somehow, in trying to find my way back to my old life, I'd discovered something infinitely better. A partnership built on genuine respect and affection. A purpose that extended beyond myself. A love that was all the more precious for being unexpected. As Alexandra bid me goodnight at my door, still maintaining some propriety even now, which made me smile, he reminded me that tomorrow we would wake up to our first full day as a deliberately married couple, that we would face whatever came next together, as we'd learned to do over these past months. I fell asleep that night with a contentment I'd never experienced before. The accidental princess had become something more, a woman who'd found love in the unlikeliest of circumstances and had the courage to embrace it fully, a woman who'd transformed a gilded cage into a home, a stranger into a partner, and an accident into the greatest deliberate choice of her life. The future would undoubtedly bring challenges. Court life would remain complicated. Expectations would continue to press down, and there would be days when I missed the simplicity of my old existence. But I would face all of it with Alexandra beside me, and that made everything possible. Our story had begun with sleep and accident, but it had transformed into something else entirely, a conscious choice, a genuine partnership, and a love that was all the more powerful for being unexpected. And as I drifted off to sleep in my beautiful apartments, no longer feeling like a prisoner, but rather like someone who'd found where she belonged, I thought about that night at the ball, one last time, about how a moment of exhaustion had led to the greatest adventure of my life. Sometimes I reflected with drowsy contentment. The best things in life were the ones we never saw coming, the accidents that revealed themselves to be destiny, the strangers who became partners, the gilded cages that transformed into homes, and sometimes, falling asleep was the first step toward finally waking up to the life you were always meant to live. 6 months after our renewal of vows, I stood in the council chamber presenting my annual report on household finances. It had become a tradition of sorts, my quarterly reviews of expenditures, recommendations for improvements, and analysis of cost savings achieved through reforms. What had begun as a desperate attempt to find purpose in an unwanted life had evolved into a genuine role within the palace administration, one that even the most traditional nobles had come to respect. The numbers I presented that afternoon were remarkable. The reforms we'd implemented had saved the crown nearly 30% on household expenses while actually improving services and staff satisfaction. The elimination of corrupt contracts had disrupted some old alliances, but it had also freed resources for more beneficial uses, increased staff wages, improved maintenance of palace grounds, and even funding for a new scholarship program that Alexandra and I had championed together. Count Beaufort, who'd replaced Rothstein as royal treasurer, praised the report effusively. Several other council members added their approval. Even the elderly Duke of Marseille, who'd been openly skeptical of my involvement initially, acknowledged that my contributions had proven invaluable to the crown's financial health. As I gathered my documents after the meeting concluded, I reflected on how surreal this moment would have seemed to the angry, lost girl who'd arrived in Auvergne less than 2 years ago. That Catherine would never have believed she could stand before the kingdom's most powerful nobles and command their respect. She would have laughed at the suggestion that she'd find genuine satisfaction in palace administration. But then, that Catherine had never met Alexandra, had never discovered that partnership could exist even within the rigid structures of royal life, had never learned that she was capable of far more than she'd imagined. Alexandra was waiting outside the council chamber, ostensibly reviewing diplomatic correspondence, but actually, I suspected, waiting to hear how the presentation had gone. When he saw my expression, he smiled with obvious relief. He asked if it had gone well, and I assured him it had. Better than well, actually. The council had approved my proposal to extend the financial review system to the crown's other holdings beyond the palace itself. It was a significant expansion of my role, one that would give me real influence over royal finances across Auvergne. His pride was evident in his expression, but there was something else there too, a hint of concern that I'd come to recognize. He asked quietly if I was certain I wanted to take on more responsibility, if I wasn't feeling overwhelmed by everything already on my shoulders. It was a fair question. In addition to my work on financial administration, I'd taken on various charitable initiatives, served as patron for several educational programs, and somehow become an unofficial advisor on matters of social reform. The Queen Mother had even begun consulting me on certain court matters, a development that still occasionally surprised me. But I assured Alexandra that I wasn't overwhelmed. Rather, I was fulfilled in a way I'd never experienced in my previous life. Each responsibility felt chosen rather than imposed, meaningful rather than merely obligatory, and knowing I had his support made even the most challenging aspects manageable. We walked together through the palace corridors toward our apartments. We'd officially combined our separate residences several months after the wedding, creating a shared space that reflected both of our personalities. As we walked, Alexandra told me about his own day. There had been a difficult negotiation with a visiting delegation, tensions over trade agreements that required careful diplomacy, but he'd been able to resolve it by proposing a compromise that satisfied both parties, and he was pleased with the outcome. I'd noticed this shift in him over the past months. He seemed more confident in his diplomatic role, more willing to trust his own judgment. When I commented on this, He credited our partnership. He told me that having someone who challenged his thinking, who asked difficult questions and offered genuinely different perspectives, had made him a better diplomat and a better prince. The compliment warmed me, but I deflected it with humor, suggesting that annoying him with questions hardly seemed like a valuable contribution to statecraft. He laughed, but insisted he was serious. The most valuable asset in any position of power, he said, was someone who would tell you the truth even when it was uncomfortable. I'd given him that gift repeatedly, and it had shaped his decision-making in countless ways. When we reached our apartments, we found Maria waiting with news that made both of us stop in our tracks. She was pregnant, expecting her first child in the spring. The joy on her face was matched only by our own excitement. Leopold would be thrilled, we knew, and the entire kingdom would celebrate the news of an heir to the crown. But what struck me most was Maria's next comment. She asked if I would consider serving as godmother to the child, a role that was traditionally reserved for family members of particular closeness and trust. The honor of it overwhelmed me. I'd gone from outsider to trusted family member in less than 2 years, and the significance of that transformation wasn't lost on me. I accepted immediately, already thinking about the kind of godmother I wanted to be. Someone who would encourage the child to think independently, to question when questioning was appropriate, to find balance between duty and authenticity. The same lessons I'd learned through my own unexpected journey. After Maria left to share the news with the rest of the family, Alexandra and I found ourselves alone in our sitting room. He pulled me close, and I settled against him with the kind of comfortable familiarity that had developed over months of partnership and intimacy. He told me that he'd been thinking about our own future, about whether we wanted children of our own. It was a conversation we'd danced around but never fully addressed, both of us perhaps waiting for the right moment. I admitted I'd been thinking about it too. The idea of having children had always been abstract in my previous life, something that might happen eventually, but wasn't particularly pressing. Now, with Alexandra, the idea felt different. Not urgent exactly, but desirable in a way it hadn't been before. He confessed that he wanted children with me, wanted to see what kind of parents we'd become. But he also wanted me to know that if I preferred to wait, or if I decided children weren't something I wanted, he would support that choice completely. Our partnership wasn't conditional on producing heirs, despite what palace tradition might suggest. The consideration behind his words moved me deeply. We discussed it properly then, talking through our hopes and concerns. I worried about how pregnancy and motherhood would affect my work on financial reform and social programs. He suggested that perhaps the reason those programs mattered so much to me was precisely because I understood their importance to future generations, that motherhood and meaningful work weren't incompatible. We didn't make any firm decisions that evening, but the conversation itself felt significant. Another example of how our relationship had evolved. We could discuss difficult topics with honesty and mutual respect, neither of us feeling pressured to agree or conform to expectations. As autumn deepened into winter, life in the palace continued its familiar rhythm, but with subtle shifts that marked how much had changed. The Queen Mother, remarkably, had become something approaching a mentor. She would invite me for private conversations about navigating court politics, sharing insights from her own decades of experience. While we would never be warmly affectionate, we'd developed a mutual respect that made our interactions far less fraught than those early terrible dinners. The court itself had fully accepted my presence. I was no longer the accidental English bride, but rather Princess Catherine, known for financial acumen and social advocacy. Young nobles sought my advice on various matters. Visiting dignitaries requested meetings. I'd somehow become a person of genuine influence, not through birth or title, but through demonstrated competence. But it was the quiet moments I treasured most. Evenings in the music room with Alexandre, where we'd play duets or simply sit while he composed new pieces. Walks in the gardens discussing everything from politics to philosophy. Late nights in our shared study, working on separate projects but enjoying the companionable silence of someone you loved nearby. It was during one of these quiet evenings, perhaps 8 months after our renewal of vows, that Alexandra surprised me with a gift. A leather-bound journal, expensive but understated, with my initials embossed on the cover. He explained that he'd been thinking about our story, about how improbable and remarkable it had been. He suggested I might want to record it, not for publication, but for ourselves, so that someday, when we were old and looking back, we could remember exactly how this had all unfolded. How anger had transformed into friendship, friendship into love, an accident into the most deliberate choice of our lives. I was touched by the gesture and the thought behind it. That night, I opened the journal and began to write. Not a polished narrative, but honest reflections on everything that had happened. The terror of waking in that carriage, the humiliation of those first dinners, the slow, dawning realization that I was falling in love with the man I'd been determined to leave. Writing it all down gave me perspective on the journey we'd taken. I could see how each challenge had shaped me, how every difficulty had revealed strength I hadn't known I possessed. The girl who'd fallen asleep at that ball had been running from herself as much as from tedious social obligations. She'd been afraid to want too much, to risk too deeply, to trust that she deserved extraordinary things. The woman I'd become had learned different lessons. That sometimes the best gifts came wrapped in crisis. That strength often emerged from situations where you had no choice but to be strong. That love, when built on genuine partnership and mutual respect, could transform everything. As winter gave way to spring and Maria's pregnancy advanced, I found myself thinking more seriously about our own future children. The idea no longer felt abstract, but rather like a natural next chapter. When I told Alexandre this one evening, his joy was immediate and unguarded. We decided not to rush, but also not to prevent what might naturally occur. And if it happened, we would face parenthood the same way we'd learned to face everything else. Together, with honesty and humor and mutual support. Spring brought Maria's son, a healthy baby boy who was immediately declared heir to the throne. The kingdom celebrated with appropriate pomp, and I took my role as godmother seriously, already planning how I would be present in his life in meaningful ways. But spring also brought unexpected news from England. My father had died peacefully in his sleep, leaving me his estate and title. It was the first real connection to my old life in nearly 2 years, and it brought a rush of complicated emotions. Alexandra immediately offered to accompany me to England for the funeral and estate matters, but I asked him to let me go alone, needing space to process this transition. He agreed without hesitation, trusting me enough to give me the independence I needed. Returning to England felt surreal. The country I'd thought I desperately missed seemed smaller somehow, more constrained. The London townhouse that had been my home felt cramped compared to the palace. Even the social circles I'd once moved in seemed limited, their concerns petty compared to the larger issues I'd come to grapple with in Auvergne. I attended the funeral, settled estate matters, and visited with old friends who were curious about my life as a princess. But through it all, I felt like a visitor rather than someone returning home. Because home, I realized with startling clarity, was no longer here. Home was a palace in Auvergne, a music room where I played duets with my husband, a library where I worked on financial reforms that actually mattered. Home was wherever Alexander was. I returned to Auvergne after 2 weeks, eager to be back. When I arrived at the palace and Alexandra met me in our apartments, the relief on his face matched my own feelings exactly. He'd missed me, he said, in ways both large and small. The quiet evenings felt too quiet without me. Making decisions felt less certain without my input. Even the music room had felt empty. I told him about England, about the strange sensation of feeling like a foreigner in what should have been familiar territory. How I'd realized that the life I'd thought I wanted back was no longer the life I actually wanted. He asked what I did want, his expression serious. And I told him the truth. I wanted exactly what we'd built together. The partnership, the purpose, the challenge of trying to make things better within the constraints of our positions. I wanted children eventually, wanted to see what kind of family we could create. I wanted to grow old with him, navigating whatever came next together. His kiss in response said everything words couldn't. But when we finally separated, he told me something that completed the circle of our story. He said that the night we'd met, when I'd fallen asleep on his shoulder, he'd wished he could freeze that moment, the contentment of it, the simplicity, the unexpected connection with someone who didn't even know his title. He'd thought then that such moments were rare gifts to be treasured, but never sustained. That real life was too complicated, too full of obligation and performance, for that kind of genuine connection to last. But we'd proven him wrong. We'd taken that single moment of accidental intimacy and built an entire life around it. We'd found ways to preserve authenticity within structure, to maintain connection despite pressure, to create spaces where we could simply be ourselves with each other. I told him that I'd thought love was something that happened gradually, with careful courtship and mutual assessment, that you built toward it through appropriate steps and proper procedures. But ours had begun with sleep and accident, with unconscious trust and unintended consequences, and somehow that foundation had proven stronger than anything I could have deliberately constructed. We spent that evening in the music room, Alexandre playing new compositions while I sat beside him, occasionally adding notes or simply listening. At some point, I realized this was where we'd eventually tell our children we fell in love. In this room, over music and conversations, and the slow revelation of each other's authentic selves. It was a good story, I thought. Improbable, but true. Funny and frightening and ultimately triumphant. The kind of story that reminded you that sometimes the best things in life were the ones you never planned for. As summer approached, and life in the palace continued its complicated dance of duty and desire, Alexandra and I maintained the routines that had become sacred to us. Morning walks in the gardens, afternoon work sessions where we'd tackle separate projects while remaining connected, evening music and conversation. These moments were the spine of our relationship, the constant thread that made everything else bearable. It was during one of these evening conversations that Alexandra told me something he'd been saving for the right moment. The council had been discussing my role within the palace administration, and they'd proposed making my position official. I would become the first royal administrator for financial reform, a title that would give me formal authority over the domains I'd already been managing informally. The offer was remarkable, unprecedented for someone of my status and background. But what moved me most was Alexandra's next comment. He said the council had made this decision without his influence, based purely on my demonstrated competence and the measurable results I'd achieved. I'd earned this position through my own merit, not through his protection or political maneuvering. I accepted, of course, but I also understood the significance of what he was telling me. I was no longer the accidental princess, the problematic bride who'd been thrust into a world she didn't understand. I was simply Catherine, competent, respected, valuable in my own right. The girl who'd woken in that carriage would never have believed this ending was possible, that she would find love, purpose, and belonging in the place she'd been so desperate to escape, that an accident could transform into the most deliberate and satisfying choice of her life. But as I sat beside Alexandre that evening, discussing plans for my new official role and dreaming about our shared future, I understood something fundamental about my journey. It hadn't been about finding a happy ending in the traditional sense. It had been about discovering that I was capable of creating my own happiness, even in circumstances I never would have chosen. The palace was still a gilded cage in many ways. The expectations and obligations remained real, and sometimes burdensome. Court life continued to be complicated, politics continued to be challenging, and there would always be people who questioned my presence or my choices, but I'd learned to find freedom within the constraints, to carve out spaces for authenticity, to build a partnership that sustained and strengthened me, to transform what had been imposed into something I actively chose every single day. And that, I realized, was perhaps the truest happily ever after. Not a perfect life without challenges, but rather the courage and capability to face whatever came with someone you loved beside you. The wisdom to recognize when an accident had given you a gift. The grace to accept the unexpected and make it your own. I'd fallen asleep on a prince's shoulder after a ball and woken up married to him. It should have been a disaster, a scandal, a tragedy of lost choice and stolen freedom. Instead, it had been the beginning of the greatest adventure of my life. And as Alexandra took my hand that evening, pulling me toward the piano for another duet, I chose him again, just as I would choose him tomorrow, and the day after, and all the days that followed. Not because I had to, but because there was nowhere else I wanted to be, and no one else I wanted to be with. The accidental princess had found her ever after, not through fairy tale magic or destiny's decree, but through her own courage, intelligence, and willingness to embrace the unexpected. And really, I thought as I settled onto the piano bench beside my deliberately chosen husband, what could be more magical than that? Our fingers found their familiar positions on the keys, and together, we began to play.